All right, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the ancient Near East, but we're going to start in this region right here, the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean is home to a number of civilizations by the time we reach the Late Bronze Age. Over in Syria and Mesopotamia, we have the Middle Assyrians. In Egypt, of course, we have the Egyptians. In central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, we have the Hittites. And then in the Aegean, we have the Mycenaeans, or Helladic peoples. And generally, we think of these as separate civilizations. But increasingly, we're beginning to realize that they were one vast interconnected civilization. And the thing that connected them was trade. In the Late Bronze Age, it's shocking how much trade is moving across the Eastern and into the Western Mediterranean. They are trading in obsidian, emery, silver. They are trading in textiles and olive oil, in grain, in barley, in beer, in all kinds of consumable goods, and also hard goods. We first started to get a sense of how important this trade was when we discovered a shipwreck called Uluburun. And Uluburun was a Bronze Age trading vessel, one of the richest trading vessels ever discovered, sunk just off the south coast of what is modern-day Turkey. This was excavated by Professor Bass. Professor Bass was a pioneer in nautical underwater archaeology at Texas A&M University. When they uncovered this and brought it up from the ocean bottom, it was full of amphora that were filled probably with oil, wine, a whole variety of other goods. And it was just shocking how much material there was here. There were ingots in glass. This was faience in glass. There were amphoras of oil. There were ostrich egg shells that were being sold, ceramics, fragments of textiles. There were finished goods and raw goods. And of course, the most important was bronze and copper. Bronze and copper was traded throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. These ingots oftentimes were cast into the shape of animal hides. We're not really certain why. That was just the standard practice. They would have these ingots, and there were ingots in copper, ingots in tin, and ingots in bronze, which of course is a mixture between about 90–95% copper and about 5 to 10% tin. Bronze was, of course, the material of the age. It was what most of the tools and all of the weapons were made out of. Bronze is relatively easy to smelt. You melt it down and you add the tin, and you can cast it into multiple forms. Here you can see an actual mold made for a Bronze Age hatchet. So bronze was incredibly versatile. Copper wasn't very versatile, but if you added just a small amount of tin to it, suddenly you got bronze, which was much harder and held an edge much better. And of course, the biggest thing was weapons. None of these societies would have existed without weapons, and all of these weapons were made out of bronze. So here we have spears and axes. We also have this beautiful thing called a khopesh. A khopesh is a bronze sickle-shaped sword. They actually found these in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, but they were very popular at the time. This heavy slashing sword, and they're very, very sharp. And then, of course, we have the amazing swords that came out of the Aegean. The double-edged sword, as we know it, was probably invented in Crete. And here we have these very long ribbed swords that were very sharp. I read a story of them uncovering a Bronze Age sword recently in Denmark, and that sword was still sharp. So bronze doesn't rust like iron. It's very easy to work with, and it's a very serviceable metal. Here you can see a variety of bronze implements, including axes, maces, spear points, and another one of these khopesh, or sickle-shaped swords. These things must have been very owie to get hurt with. And as you can see, they look almost as good as the day they were made. Well, one of the problems with bronze is that copper is relatively common. You can find it in lots of places. Copper was found in southeastern Turkey. It was found in Timna, which is in modern-day Israel. It was found in the mountains of the Balkans and many different locations. But tin itself is rare, and there's not nearly as many tin deposits as there are copper deposits. Every country could secure its own copper, but not every country could secure its own tin. Tin had to come from Spain or from England, or the other source it was coming from was further east, places like Afghanistan. Those are way outside of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so you depended upon trade to get you tin, and with no tin, there is no bronze. Now let's go back and revisit the Aegean. Remember what we said about the Aegean? At the end of the Aegean, you had the powerful Mycenaean Confederation, and somehow it came into conflict with this power known as Troy, and this sparked off the Trojan War. Whether it happened the way the Iliad and the mythology tells us, with the judgment of Paris and Helen of Troy and the Trojan horse, who knows? But it definitely sparked some kind of crisis and ultimately led to the destruction of Aegean civilization. All of the major cities, all of the major forts and citadels were destroyed in a 50-year period. And this seems to have unleashed chaos on the entire Eastern Mediterranean. At around the same time, a mass movement of people, what are known as sea peoples, started flooding into the Eastern Mediterranean from the west. We're not exactly certain who these people are, but they came into this territory and they completely destroyed large sections of civilization. They swept in through central Anatolia and completely wiped out the Hittite civilization. It was destroyed and it never recovered. They went into Assyria and Lebanon and burned cities. The cities that were destroyed is a long list. Ugarit, Kadesh, Katna, Hamath, Alaka, Aleppo, Carchemish, Imar. All of them wiped out. They eventually worked their way down to the Levantine coast and found their way to Egypt, and in Egypt they were finally repulsed by Rameses III. Ugarit is located right there, and we actually have letters from the governor of Ugarit to these locations, other locations, begging for help and begging for assistance. The governor of Ugarit, a guy by the name of Amurapi, writes a letter describing the situation. He says to his political superior, which he calls his father, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon it." He appeals for aid to the viceroy of Carchemish. But the viceroy just, rebuffs his pleas. He says, "As for what you have written to me, ships of the enemy have been seen at sea. Well, you must remain firm. Indeed, for your part, where are your troops, your chariots stationed? Are they not stationed near you? No, behind the enemy who press upon you? Surround your towns with ramparts. Have your troops and chariots enter there, and await the enemy with great resolution." Well, we know that they may have, girded their loins and met with resolution, but they were ultimately destroyed. Well, ultimately, these sea peoples, as they were called, found their way down to Egypt, where Ramses III ultimately defeated them, but at great cost. And we saw this monument when we looked at Egypt. This is the pylons of his mortuary temple that show him repelling these barbarians from the sea. They even name them Palestir and Shardana, Ekwesh, Teresh, Luca, Sheridan, Denyen, Jeker. So these were organized peoples. They had names at least. Ramses boasts over his victory of them and says, "He, unruly Sheridan, whom no one had ever known how to combat. They came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them." But of course, Ramses is able to withstand them, and he records in epic fashion this huge battle that takes place. Here you can see him with his bow and his chariot, and you can see the ocean battle engaging, and below you can actually see all of the prisoners being led away, being taken away by the Egyptians in rows. He boasts, he says, "The wretched fallen chief of Libya, son of Dead, has fallen upon the country with his bowmen, Sheridan, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, Teresh, taking the best of every warrior and every man of war of his country. He has brought his wife and his children, leaders of the camp, and he has reached the western boundary." So he's saying that, they were basically kicking butt and taking names everywhere they went, but he manages to push them back. So he's justly proud of this event, and all evidence seems to be that this is accurate. Here you can see the depiction. You can always tell the sea peoples because they're shown in unusual hats. The Egyptians have the usual wigs and helmets, and then the sea peoples are going to have these feathered caps. You can see that in the prisoners being led away. They have these kind of elaborate feathered headdresses, or sometimes they're wearing strange caps with horns on them. But either way, it's clear that these are not Egyptians. They're somebody else other than Egyptians. So who were the sea peoples? We don't actually know the answer to this question, but the fact that they show up right after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization is probably a big clue. They sweep into Anatolia and destroy the Hittites, and this makes sense. It seems that whatever caused the collapse in the Mycenaean world actually caused these people to flee. When you have a collapse of civilization, the first thing that happens is you run out of food. Just look at our situation. I mean, criminy, you can't find toilet paper or sanitizing wipes anywhere anymore. And that's because when people get stuck in a crisis, the first thing they reach for is supplies. And unfortunately, at this time, there were no supplies, but there were civilizations to the east, civilizations they had trade with, that did. And so they went into Anatolia, they went along the coast, down across the Levant and Egypt, and eventually had to be repelled back by Rameses III. So there's some clue in their names. Vowels shift in ancient languages and consonants shift. A lot of ancient languages don't even bother with vowels. If you know anything about Hebrew, Hebrew doesn't bother with vowels. You're supposed to intuit the vowels in modern Hebrew. And so something like Denyen might be the Danoi. The Danoi is a name for a tribe of Greeks. Ekwesh might be the Achaeans. The Achaeans is another tribe of Greeks. We also have some evidence that they settle in Sardinia. That's maybe where the name Shardana gets attached to it. And we also think that Palestir might be the Philistines. So they move and swing down into this territory. And by doing so, the entire Eastern Mediterranean is transformed. Looking at this region, the delta of Egypt and the lower Levant, this is the region known as modern-day Israel. And this section here is known as Gaza. This area here is known as Gaza. And these are the cities of the Philistines. So if you've read your Bible or gone to Sunday school, of course, you know the story of the Philistines. The story of the Philistines is that they were constantly this thorn in the side of the ancient Israelites. And of course, it is Goliath of Gath, who is the giant who goes up against David. And so David had to slay him. But when we look at the material culture of the Philistines, it looks very, very similar. So this is a pot by Mycenaeans, but this is a pot by Philistines. And they're virtually identical. They're identical in iconography and form, except the pottery of the Philistines is made from clay taken from the Levant. So that strongly suggests that these are the same peoples. That after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, some remnant of the Mycenaean, known as Palestir, came to this region and ultimately settled in the region we know as Philistia, which is now part of Gaza and modern-day Palestine. And they started making pots out of the native clay that was there. One of the big questions is, okay, so why did they come this direction? Well, again, if we look to the Nile Delta, there's a clue. There's an ancient site in the Nile Delta that anciently was known as Avaris, but is today known as Tel el-Daba. And Tel el-Daba actually has a palace, but it doesn't look like an Egyptian palace. It instead has large magazines, a large courtyard. And when you dig into this palace, you find the most amazing things. You find shaft graves. Not Egyptian-style graves, but Aegean-style graves. And in those Aegean-style graves, you find Mycenaean swords. And you see boar's teeth from boar's tooth helmets. You even see gold plaques, like we see before. If you go elsewhere looking in the palace, you actually find frescoes. And in those frescoes are bull leapers. Here's a reconstruction of a detail of a bull leaper. And here's a reconstruction of these bull leapers. This is not in the Aegean. This was found in Egypt. And yet, for all the appearance, it looks like something Aegean. So let's take a look at that map again. Remember how much trade is going on? If you are doing trade across the region, it makes sense that you're going to set up ports and cities with your own people to facilitate that trade. So it seems that Hittites had ports in the Aegean sphere, Aegeans had ports in Egypt and the Levant, and Middle Assyrians likewise had ports throughout the region, and you would ship into your ports. So there were already significant numbers of Aegeans living in the Levant and living in Egypt at the time that the collapse happens. And this kind of explains what's going on. Mycenae collapses, the Mycenaean civilization collapses, you run out of food, you gotta go somewhere, so where do you go? You move in with your cousins who are living across the sea, and you go there because you know they have food, but there's more people coming than they can handle, and so ultimately this leads to war. You have a refugee crisis on your hands. And it's one thing if you have a few hundred people coming in every once in a while to do trade, that benefits you. But when you suddenly have thousands or tens of thousands moving in, that's more than any civilization can assimilate. And the only choice there is war, and they knew that too, so they clearly went with the intent to pillage these areas that they knew about because they were already trading with them. And this causes a complete collapse of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're not entirely certain what causes the Bronze Age collapse. The invasion by the Sea Peoples seems to be a big part of it, but the invasion by the Sea Peoples may be the last chapter in a very long story. There were also a great number of earthquakes in the region at the time. There was also political instability. You have instability in the Aegean, potentially in the Trojan War. Because of this, you have famine, or some combination of all these. It was a perfect storm to where ultimately these populations could not be sustained, and they just started moving east and caused this massive destruction. And the consequences of the Bronze Age collapse are enormous. First off, Greek enters into a dark age where they're really not up to making anything. No monumental sculpture, no monumental architecture for nearly 400, 500 years. It's pretty remarkable. The Hittite civilization is gone, wiped out in a matter of less than a decade. No more Hittite cities, and they never come back. The Greeks eventually come back in a few hundred years. Egypt goes into decline. You have this massive decline of Egypt. Egypt manages to hold off the invaders, but it can only hold them off at a great cost to itself, and after this it will fall to later invaders. It's the only one of these powers that survives relatively intact, but this enters us into the late period for Egypt, where Egypt ends up being a provincial holding of larger empires. The other thing it does is it disrupts the tin trade. Remember what I said about tin? Let me go back to that slide. I know I'm jumping around a bit, but let's do it. Remember what I said about tin? Tin can only be found in a few spots in the world. Well, if the entire Eastern Mediterranean is on fire, and people are screaming and running for their lives, and everybody is pillaging, nobody is going to be getting in their ships and trading tin. And you're certainly not going to trade tin to your enemies, because they might make them into weapons, and bronze weapons, and come and attack you with them. So that's not a good thing. So this actually ushers in the Iron Age, and the arrival of iron, and with it, the Iron Age empires. Now, people in the Bronze Age actually knew how to work iron. This is a bronze dagger from the tomb of Tutankhamun on top, but below is an iron dagger. Now we think this iron dagger is made out of meteoric iron, but people knew about iron. They understood what iron was. People had worked iron at locations. And so the question is like, well, okay, why didn't we get to the Iron Age sooner? Why didn't people just start using iron if they knew how to use iron? Why did they have to be forced to use iron? Well, the answer is because iron is a lot harder to work than bronze. As I said, bronze can be melted, has a relatively low melting point, and you can cast it into easy blocks. Iron has a very high melting temperature, and it takes a lot more time and energy to melt iron. And then once you melt iron and produce iron, you have to work it with a hammer like a blacksmith. It's not something that's very easy to cast, and when you do cast iron, it's brittle. It has a high carbon content, and that's not very good. Doesn't make any useful weapons. In fact, the first iron tools, pure iron is actually softer than bronze and doesn't hold an edge as well as bronze. And to make steel, you have to work the iron a lot. You have to heat it up, hammer it, flatten it, fold it over, and fold it again and again and again. Making iron is just an enormous chore. You have to take the iron ore, you have to put it into a furnace, and you have to melt it down for an entire day at really high temperatures. And then at the end of that, you don't even actually end up with a proper chunk of iron like you do with bronze. You end up with this thing called a bloom. And a bloom is a messy, spongy, glassy mess of iron mixed with slag. And then you slowly have to hammer this thing into wrought iron by working it over. That's what wrought iron means, is you work the iron over to make it into decent iron. And then as you work it over a fire as a blacksmith, it will transform under certain conditions, if you know what you're doing, into steel. So it's a lot more labor intensive. It's a lot harder to work, and there were very, very few people in the Bronze Age that had the skill to work iron. And so most of the iron implements that we find before that are pretty rare. A few of them may have been smelted. Some are meteoric iron that somebody just happened to find on, and it's like, oh wow, you know, you find a meteor that fell from the sky. That's a little easier to work than having to go to all this effort to make a bloom. So what ends up happening is people do not move to iron because it's so hard to work, and they only move to iron when they're forced to. So you can kind of do an iron versus bronze, you know, matchup, if you will. So bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. It's very easy to cast. It holds a nice edge. Beautiful bronze weapons. There's lots of videos online if you want to go see people testing bronze weapons. They work very, very well. They will cut you deep. Iron, on the other hand, has to be made out of an alloy of iron and carbon, and the only way to do that is to know how to work it as a blacksmith, so it's difficult. Copper and tin are easier to smelt. They're easier to melt down, to cast, and to work. Iron ore is difficult to smelt and work. You have to go through this process of creating the bloom. You have a relatively low skill level in order to master bronze, where it takes a very high skill level to master iron. And not only that, you have to be trained. You have to have an apprenticeship with a master who knows what he's doing. That master has to have worked a lifetime to develop those skills. But on the other side, iron is harder, stronger, and sharper. Well, not iron, but steel. Steel really, even though it rusts, it doesn't have as great as preservation properties and anti-rusting properties as bronze, but boy, does it hold an edge, and it will hold that edge longer, and it will hold it sharper than bronze will. And copper, ultimately, copper is common, but tin is rare, which means in order to make bronze, you are dependent on a very complex trading system. You are dependent on some other nation to bring you and sell you tin. And if they don't sell you tin, either because they've collapsed and they're not doing it, or they've decided, we're not going to sell you tin, you're just going to make tin into bronze and turn the bronze into weapons to come after us. So that's a problem. You are dependent upon those trade routes. But iron is everywhere. Iron's practically, after silica, it's the second most common element in the Earth's crust. It's just everywhere. Everybody has iron. And it's readily available, and it doesn't need complex trade routes. You can find it, you can make it. And so what we see is there's a trade-off. There's a point where, you know, iron is known, but nobody's bothering with it because it's just too much of a hassle. And it isn't until tin becomes impossible to find because the trade routes have been blown up and because society is crashing down all around you, it's not until then that you're forced to say, okay, let's have a second look at iron. And I didn't think I liked iron, but, you know, now that I can't get tin, let's take a look at iron. And once they figure it out, then it takes off. And we've been using iron as the main source for our tools ever since. And you can see the impact of it immediately. We start to see some really nice swords. Now this one is badly, badly rusted and corroded, but when this thing was made, it must have been a marvel. And this thing dates to the Iron Age, Iron Age 1, somewhere around the year 600 BCE. This is the Vera Jericho sword. It has the same shape as a traditional kind of Eastern Mediterranean or Aegean sword. It has a center rib to strengthen it, but it's made out of two parts. The handle is made out of wrought iron, but they understood that some iron was steel and some could be made into steel, and the other one is an iron was not as sharp. So they made the handle out of iron, but the blade edge is made out of steel. And this would have given it a very strong cutting edge. You can see how the rib, the strengthening rib, and the handle are made out of wrought iron, but the edge itself is made out of steel. And this would have made this just a devastating weapon. Far more effective than any bronze weapon, and bronze weapons are plenty effective. And so after this point, iron becomes the predominant material. And it's not an accident that this is the time of the rise of the first true empires. We've had some regional powers, some big nation states up to this time, but iron is what makes really extensive empires. The Neo-Assyrians are the first probably true empire. And the definition of an empire is kind of fungible, it's kind of fuzzy, but basically a difference between an empire and a big powerful kingdom is a kingdom only rules its own people, whereas an empire rules multiple peoples or multiple kingdoms and rules many different nations and brings them under their subjugation. It has broad, extensive power, vast civil bureaucracies. And the Assyrians would not have been able to conquer the known world had it not been for iron. Of course, there's a downside to this is that the Assyrians then used iron and the technological advantage it gave them to inflict some major horrors on people. So here's some people being flayed alive after the siege of Lachish. So we move from the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age sometime around the year 1100 to 900. There's no hard date on that. Somewhere around the year 1200 is when you have the Bronze Age collapse happen. Some people want to be specific about it and put it around the year 1177 or 1178, but I think that's a little bit too hard. But around that time, around the year 1200, you have a complete collapse of most of the major powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then from that time up to about the year 900 is where they're figuring out what's going to happen next, and they start to invent iron and start to use iron. So at this time, we have a lot of different powers. The Kassites are the last kind of iteration of Mesopotamian culture, going all the way back through the old Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Akkadians. Then we have the rise of a group called the Middle Assyrians. They're Assyrian, but then we have the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire dominates the entire range of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia. They even conquer Egypt and bring Egypt under their control. And they have a long empire that lasts for a couple hundred years. And the major powers are going to be guys like Assurnarsipal, Sennacherib, and Assurbanipal, but there's a whole host of them. And what we're going to see from this time onward, as we move into the Iron Age, is that we're going to see one empire supplant another empire. So the Assyrians come to power, they conquer everybody, the Neo-Assyrians, but then they are conquered by the Neo-Babylonians. So the remnant of the Kassites and the Akkadians and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia reassert their dominance, and for about 150 years there, They create this vast empire that conquers everything. And then they're conquered by a group of people further to the east, the Persians. And they swing in. And then the Persians are ultimately conquered by the Greeks and Alexander the Great. And so it's going to be the trade-off of one empire after another in the ancient Near East, and it's going to continue right up through the time of the Romans. And we are forevermore after this point in the age of empires. So let's talk about the Neo-Assyrians. So the Neo-Assyrians are probably the first expansive Iron Age empire, genuinely a major power. Their capital is in the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, on the northern river, on the Tigris River, and they're an extraordinarily macho culture, really incredibly militaristic culture, as you can see. This is Assurbanipal slaying a lion. I don't know how many people grab a lion by the throat and stab it through, even if the thing's been shot with arrows a few times. But you can see by this imagery the kind of image they wanted to project. An image of absolute, complete, total domination. And their artwork is all about that. And they conquer virtually everything. They conquer all of the Near East, all of the Levant, all of Egypt, everything from the Persian Gulf right up to southeastern Turkey and a few other areas. Their capital is located right here on the upper Tigris River, and it's the capital of Nineveh. And now I must tell you a story. So when I was a sophomore, I was living in Jerusalem, studying abroad, and I was studying archaeology, art history, and I was studying for my ancient Near Eastern final. I was taking an ancient Near Eastern civilization course from Bill Hamlin, who I think is retired now, but he was teaching at BYU at the time. And I was there in Jerusalem, and all of us were just cramming like crazy. He was a really tough teacher. He was a really tough teacher, and we were all cramming like crazy. And we just decided, screw it, we're done. We're taking a study break. We're not going to learn anymore. We're done. And so somebody had smuggled in a copy of Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail. This was the BYU Study Center, so this was major contraband. We were not supposed to have this. Snuck into a room, put it put the video cassette in a VCR. If you don't know what a VCR is, ask your parents. It's like a DVD, which is like streaming, but never mind. And we were watching it, and we got all the way to the end, and we got to the famous scene where they find the bridge keeper to the castle Arg, and he asks the question, "What is the capital of Assyria?" And we all just, our chins just dropped, and we all stared at each other and mouthed silently to each other, "Nineveh." We actually knew one of the answers to the unanswerable questions at the end of Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail. And now, so do you. You know that the capital of Assyria is Nineveh. And if you ever find out what the airspeed of an unladen swallow is, don't tell me. I don't want to know, because it's certainly going to mean the end of my life. All right, okay, enough of that. Moving on. So one of the things that we really remark on the Assyrian civilization, Neo-Assyrian civilization, is how violent it was. And they weren't just kind of violent, they reveled in the violence. This is from a relief from the southwestern palace of Sennacherib, and it shows the siege of Lachish. Lachish is a city in Levant. It's in modern-day Israel. And this city was utterly destroyed and razed to the ground. It's a little bit hard to see here, but in this drawing, you can see that we have people on ramps. They've got ramps going up to the city wall. People are throwing torches and rocks down on them, but they're riding these ramps, and they actually have battering rams. Do you see these battering rams here? And siege towers that they're pushing up against the city. And here you see them, you know, with their arrows going up. It's like a scene out of Lord of the Rings or Helm's Deep. It's really kind of brutal. And right here, on this scene here, coming out of the tower, you can see the aftermath of the battle. This is what we call continuous narrative. That is, they show you the battle as if it is already completed. So they show you the battle mid-action, but there's some details that are already after the action. And here is a lovely scene of people being impaled on pikes. And this was standard practice for the Neo-Assyrians. They would come to a city and they would say, look, you're going to surrender. And if you don't surrender, we're going to kill every single man, woman, and child in the city, and we're going to stick their bodies on pikes all around the city and let them rot and be taken by the animals. And anyone who comes by and sees this will know not to mess with us. Well, a few cities will resist, but after a while this becomes the psychological equivalent of an atomic bomb. That they know that if they fail, it's absolute, complete, total obliteration. So many places would say, okay, we surrender. And this was basically ruling by intimidation and fear. The other thing they did was forced deportations. Notice that you have these people being led out of the city. These are the prisoners being led out of the city. I know it's kind of strange. The battle is raging all around them and they're already leading people out of the city. But here are other scenes of people being deported, and you can see their hands are raised in a gesture of crying and mourning, and they are being taken out of the city and they're being deported to a new country. One of the things that the Neo-Assyrians learned is that if you leave people in their own home country, they tend to revolt. But if you take them out of that country and you make them slaves in a far part of your empire, it's much harder for them to revolt because they don't know the territory, they don't have the resources, they don't have anything. And so this deportation was a way of subjugating and conquering people, leading them away into bondage. And we know this happened. Again, if you read your Bible, you will know that the 10 tribes of Israel were besieged in the year 721 and were again, and later in the 7th century, several times actually, and they were taken away and, lost. That's why we call them the lost tribes of Israel. Here's that scene of the flaying. These are the governors. So these people were the governors of the city, and they had dared to resist. So here they are being flayed alive. In other words, don't mess with the Assyrians. Okay, so Nineveh is the capital, but there are also adjacent cities around it. Khosrow, Nimrud being the most important. These were palace cities. So, you have the capital of the city, but just outside, 30 miles away, you'll have the palace. It's always good for the king to be a little bit outside of the major urban areas. And these are where we find the royal palaces at Nimrud. We have a number of palaces here. We have the Northwest Palace and the Southwest Palace. The Northwest Palace is going to be built by a collection of individuals, Assurnarsipal, Tiglath-Pileser, and then we have the Southwest Palace that's built by Sennacherib and occupied by a few others. These are built around a central courtyard, but they're organized in a way so that you go from less, private places to more private places. Here you can see you enter in from the courtyard, and inside there are major gates, and only the king and his entourage and his courtiers are allowed past those inner gates. There's not much left today because it's mostly made out of mud brick, but alas, there's even less than you can see in this photo because this area was conquered by ISIS, and in 2015 they actually took a bulldozer to it and detonated it with explosives. I remember that I gave this lecture in 2015, and just 2 weeks later after I gave this lecture, I got the news that this had all been destroyed. You can see how it's just been destroyed. It's just devastating. So much of what you're going to be seeing here is long since gone. Thank goodness that some of this had actually been removed by Europeans. I guess, yay, imperialism and colonialism. We stole all your stuff before you got a chance to bust it yourself. Oh, well. Life is messy. But here are some photos of what it used to look like before ISIS destroyed it. Here you can see that we have these two lion figures with human parts. They're kind of like lion man centaurs, but with wings. And then we have this massive bull figure, and the bull figure has a human head. These are truly gigantic sculptures. You can't get a sense of the scale here. This is the best one I found that shows the scale. This is a common feature of ancient Near Eastern art of the Iron Age. These are called Lamassu. They're also sometimes called Shedu. Lamassu or Shedu are human-bull hybrids. Sometimes they're lions, but usually bulls. And these are guardian figures. They serve the same purpose as the Sphinx. They indicate the divine space. This is the space where you enter into the presence of the king. Remember, in the ancient Near East, sometimes the king is given a divine mandate from the gods. Sometimes he's kind of a god himself. That same kind of view persists. So we have these beautiful entryways. Here's another one. This one's from Khosrabad. It's currently in the Louvre. But you can see these figures. One of the things that you'll notice is that they have, strangely, 5 legs. And that shows that they're really thinking of these as reliefs, not as sculptures in the round. They are meant to be attached to the wall, and so they want everyone to know that they know these animals have 4 legs, so that when you see them from this direction, you see all 4 legs, and then when you see them from this direction, you see the 2 legs. So they're kind of like very deep reliefs that have wrapped around a corner. The stylization is very heavy. You have these very heavily patterned beards, stylized eyes, and other features. These things exist at the entrances to these palaces, and in this case, these palaces always, represent the sacred space. And so here you see the king entering in between them, and that's an indication that he is the sacred figure. Plus, the construction of these itself is a kind of display of power. So not only does it display the ruler as divine, just the fact that you can bring something this massive is evidence of your power and your majesty. And in fact, we actually have reliefs showing them bringing them. So here you can see its head is broken off, but here's one of these bull human-headed Lamassu, and it's on an enormous sledge. You can see how they're dragging it with ropes. People are putting boards underneath it to keep it from sinking into the sand. Guys back here are pulling on massive levers. They've even thrown ropes over the levers to give this a little extra juice. And then the guys are walking along with it with poles to push it and prod it along, and also to balance it so that it doesn't fall down. So, they even show the depiction of these things in the reliefs. And I think the reason is simple, that it shows you have power. You control enormous resources, and you can force, several thousand guys to haul in really nice, beautiful statues like this. Here's one that's a lion. You can again see the 5th leg, which you can see the 5th leg here, which is again reflected here. Again, they want you to see these as reliefs, kind of as you turn a corner coming into the space. As you came into the space, you'd actually have to make a right-hand turn to actually see the king. This is an indication that the king was seen as somehow semi-divine, that, or divine, that you don't look at his presence, because if you did, this would be wrong. And so the king, his throne is actually at a 90-degree angle from the entrance, so no one can accidentally walk by the entrance and peek in. And all along the lower walls of this palace, there were reliefs, thin slabs of stone. Here's a different reconstruction of them, same thing, and these reliefs were all along the walls. Most of these reliefs, as you might guess, are all about the king and his greatness. The Neo-Assyrians, not Neo-Sumerians, that's a different group. The Neo-Assyrians very much wanted to show their authority. So you have images that assert the authority of the king. Here we can see Assurnarsipal on his throne. He has attendants who have fly whisks, who are fanning him. He holds his cup. You can tell that it's very flat. Boy, he's got some killer forearms. The muscles are exaggerated, but it's very stiff. The eye isn't quite a frontal eye, isn't quite a profile eye. It's kind of halfway in between. But the beard is very stylized. One of the things I always found interesting is that there's also lengthy inscriptions in cuneiform indicating his achievements, but they just write them right over the statuary. They just don't have a respect for it. It's kind of interesting. Elsewhere, you're going to see images of birded figures or images of the exploits of the king. And so all of this is meant to show the divine mandate of the king, that the king is blessed of the gods and has the authority of the gods. Here you can see the king. The king is holding his bow and his arrows. It's a little bit awkward because these arrows go behind the arm that's in back, but I think the artist didn't want to confuse anybody about this. He didn't want to cross over the body of the king and cause any confusion. And so therefore, you know, his body is preserved. And over here, it's very similar. He has a kind of sword at his side. And then you have these divine figures, these characters by their crowns, or by the fact that they have the heads of eagles and vultures, and that they have wings, are clearly not human. They're divine figures. And you'll notice that they're all carrying buckets. These are buckets of scented water. And they are anointing the king. They have a pine cone, and the pine cone would be dipped into the bucket. And if you know a pine cone has all these surfaces, this would draw up a lot of water, and then you would use the pine cone to sprinkle him. And this was a way of demonstrating that he had the favor of heaven. Really, the muscles on Assyrian art are just really exaggerated. Check out these calves and the knees. Again, this is to make it look very strong. Here's another example. This is the king, and we have the king twice over. So this is the king, and this is the same king over here. He is likewise being blessed by these heavenly figures with their situlas, their buckets full of rose water or scented water, and their pine cones. And the king is under the presence of this figure here. Remember this figure? We've seen this before. We saw this in Hittite art. This is a winged disc. This is a solar disc, and emerging out of the solar disc is a figure of a man. This is the representation of their deity. This is probably the national deity Ashur, who is the national deity of Assyria. And underneath him is a strange device. It's this very elaborate piece of metalworking that is meant to look like a tree or a piece of vegetation. And these are kind of abstract symbols, but this represents the male aspect of God, and this thing represents the female aspect of God. So the tree represents Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, and the other one represents the god of the skies. So you have the earth and the sky, the sun and the moon, or the sun and Venus, I guess, if it's Ishtar. You have all of the gods together blessing him and his rule. Elsewhere we see scenes that demonstrate his abject power. We have tribute scenes. These are Phoenicians, you can tell because they're wearing unique clothes that do not look Assyrian. But they are bringing tribute. In this case, they're bringing monkeys. Monkeys are fun pets. Everybody loves monkeys. So tribute or gifts or bribes, if you will. These are like, don't kill us, don't conquer us. We'll bring you lots of money. And you'll hear this, that you'll read, I've been reading the Old Testament. I've been reading in Kings and Chronicles. I don't recommend it. It's kind of boring and not very enlightening. But there's always these scenes where, you know, the kings of Israel or Judah will take all the gold from their palace or from their temple and send it to the king of Assyria, basically saying, don't kill me. Please don't kill me. And that's what tribute was for. Here you see a surrender before Sennacherib. This is the king, and notice that the king is shown smaller than Sennacherib. So Sennacherib is here being fanned by his maidens, and all these people are basically pleading for their lives. Please don't kill us. This is a wonderful scene. This is Assurbanipal, and Assurbanipal is enjoying a garden retreat with his queen. Assurbanipal is relaxing upon a couch. In front of him are set tables of food. His wife brings a cup up to bless him. Musicians are playing, as well as people fanning him and blessing him. Their incense stands. He really is. Here's musicians behind here and people holding fans. It's a great scene. It's a nice little garden party. But here's a decorating tip for your next garden party. Sitting here in the tree is the head of Tuaman, the king of Elam. And he had just recently conquered the king of Elam, and the king of Elam decided not to surrender, so he had his head cut off and hung it in a tree for his garden party. That's a decorating tip you won't hear on Martha Stewart. And I want to point out, this is the kind of stuff they put up in their own palace. All this death, destruction, war. This is the kind of stuff they're putting up in their throne rooms and their palaces. Yeah, they're basically saying, We are serious, badass mofos. Do not mess with us. One of the most amazing series of panels are the lion hunt scenes. These are scenes that show the king in all of his prowess hunting lions. Lions, of course, they're extinct in the Near East today, but they actually existed back then. Lion is, of course, a terribly fierce animal, so he would ride around on his chariot, his charioteer, here he is, and fill these lions with arrows until he could get close enough for the coup de grace and take him out with his own spear or sword. And again, this is just projection of power by another means. These are very dynamic. The lions are shown in various states. Some of the lions are shown injured with arrows and spears running through them, vomiting out blood. This one shows a lioness, and the lioness has actually had an arrow go through its spine, so its back legs are paralyzed, and it's having to drag its poor back legs along in agony. Here's another lion that's vomiting up blood. These are really kind of gory, but, you know, I mean, they're showing the governors of a city flayed alive and people impaled on sticks and the head of the king up in the, you know, the garden tree. So what's interesting, if anything, they show the lions with a bit more dignity than they show the humans. But again, the emphasis is on the muscle. Notice the stylized mane that's patterning. So it remains relatively abstract, but it's all this projection of power. Well, everyone hated the Assyrians. And so it's not surprising that the Assyrians themselves get wiped out and conquered. And they get conquered by the Neo-Babylonians. And the Babylonians were pretty hardcore, but they were not nearly as militaristic or as nasty as the Assyrians were. However, they did still continue the practice of deportations. And so when they conquer the Levant and ancient Israel, this is the Babylonian captivity. They destroy Jerusalem, they destroy the Temple of Solomon, and they haul the Jews back to Babylon. But then many of those Jews end up becoming courtiers and servants to the king himself. So if you've read the stories of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and Daniel in the lion's den, you'll know that they were, you know, servants. They were princes of Israel, but they were servants in the court. This is a common feature, is you take the elites from the places you conquer, who are obviously pretty well educated, and you bring them back and you make them your high functionaries, your bureaucracy in the new empire. So the Babylonians conquered almost all the same territory. Egypt manages to reassert its independence under the Nubians, but it will eventually be reconquered by the Persians. And so this is the new Babylonians. These people are ethnically the same as the old Babylonians, but this is 1,000 years after. 1,000 years. Think about how long civilization is. This is 1,000 years after the time of the old Babylonians and Hammurabi. It's really quite amazing. And they turned Babylon, the city of Babylon, into one of the ancient wonders, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And it truly is a marvel. So when we look at ancient Babylon, one of the main features is the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar is this goddess to Near Eastern people. She is very similar to Inanna. She is a goddess of Venus, the morning and evening star. She's also a goddess of love, war, art, music, a lot of things. She's also closely associated with the royal family and is seen as a patron deity to the royal family. So it makes sense that this gate would be the royal entrance. This gate was immediately adjacent to the palace and also to the temple of Marduk. And so only the highest level of individuals would be using this gate. The king courtiers, high-ranking generals and officials, and then people who were high-ranking officials from other nations who were coming to visit the king. This thing had collapsed, but it was excavated by the Germans in the early 20th century, and they found, even though this was made mostly out of mud brick, it was covered in fired glazed tiles that had these beautiful, almost iridescent glazed quality. It's actually shocking how how bright blue and how well the tiles have held up. So they brought these tiles back and reconstructed it. So that's why if you want to go see the Ishtar Gate, you got to go to Berlin, because that's where it's located. It was covered in these tiles, so it must have just been a wonder. And just you can imagine how beautiful it must have been. The thing is covered in a series of heraldic animals, bulls, lions, and dragons. These are all animals that, again, are guardian animals that represent the power and authority of the Babylonian state. And they're not just flat. They actually have dimension. They are molded. So these would have had to have been molded out of ceramic, glazed, fired. This is really quite skilled. If you know anything about ceramic, it shrinks when it's fired. And so in order to get something to line up this well, you really have to do this well. This is this dragon, which has kind of the body of a serpent, but the fore parts of a lion, and the hind parts of like a vulture. Has the head of a snake and a single horn that emerges. Again, this is probably maybe a representation of Tiamat, maybe a representation of these dragons that represent the forces of chaos. But again, it's a guardian figure. Here we see a bull. Bulls are associated with solar imagery. In Near Eastern mythology, it is a bull that carries the sun across the sky. And so, therefore, this represents power. All of this is meant to indicate that you are coming into the divine space, the space of the king. So just past the Ishtar Gate, we get to the palace. And just past the palace, and adjacent to it, is the Temple of Marduk. Marduk is the national deity of the Babylonians. So they accepted the worship of all of the other ancient Near Eastern gods, Anu, Enlil, Ishtar, etc., but they write their own national deity into it, Marduk. And so Marduk becomes the salvational god. He is the god that fights against Tiamat and the forces of chaos and brings order to the universe and inherits the tablets of destiny. If you know ancient Near Eastern mythology, Anu, the creator god, gives the tablets of destiny, which is like a law code, and this empowers anybody who holds it to have all of the power of Anu, to have all the powers of heaven. And he gives this first in the Sumerian and the Akkadian versions. He gives this to Enlil, the kind of sky god. But when we get to the Babylonians, the Enlil surrenders the tablets of destiny and he gives them to Marduk to show that the succession of Marduk. And it's a ziggurat, so much like the ziggurat of Urnamu in the Neo-Sumerian times, we have a series of tiered structures, again, solid masonry, with a single staircase that goes up and several other staircases, and at the very top would have been a temple, and the temple was likewise adorned in blue glazed tile. This is the location, this and the palace would have been the location of the famed Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was specifically the part that was mentioned by Pausanias and other writers as one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And we don't know exactly where this was. In fact, some people think it may not actually have existed, but I think most people think it existed. The Babylonians were known for their waterworks. They had excellent irrigations. They actually had pumping stations that could pump water up to higher locations so that it could flow down. They had aqueducts and channels and interior plumbing. It was quite sophisticated. And the story goes that one of the kings of Babylon has a wife that comes from Syria. Well, Babylon is in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia is flat, doesn't have any mountains, and it's also, while the city itself is lush and green, there are no hills, there's no trees, no forests, nothing like that. And his wife, who was from Syria, lived in the hills of Syria where there were forests and trees and you know, all kinds of garden landscape. So the legend is that he built her an artificial mountain, and that on every tier of this he brought plants from Syria, from Persia, from the Levant, from all over, so that she could enjoy the vegetation, and that it was all naturally, they had pumping stations where water was pumped up so that there were waterfalls flowing everywhere. I have a few descriptions of it. We're not exactly certain. There's been no archaeological evidence that it's ever been discovered. Here's a rather fanciful version of it, but less fanciful than some. But it probably existed in the realms of the palace. The palace itself was also completely covered in blue tile. Here we see this facade, a segment of the facade, and we have very stylized palm trees. Palm trees are associated with royalty. They are a feature of royalty. And then underneath them we have lions, which are also associated with royalty. So here's what this would have looked like. You would have come in, there would have been these massive Lamassus entering into the palace, and you have all of the symbols. Notice that the symbolism of the Ishtar Gate, the symbolism of the Temple of Marduk, and the symbolism of the palace are all the same. We have the same characters everywhere we go. Here, the lions are also three-dimensional. So we have this beautiful tiled mosaic with these wonderful lions. It's really interesting looking at Near Eastern art because the Babylonian stuff, and they're actually better at rendering anatomy on the lions than they are on people. They actually are a little bit more realistic, but they still have this very patterned hair. Beautiful stuff. Well, this brings us to Persia. So here we have to describe a little bit more about the Persians. The Persians are not Near Eastern peoples. I know that sounds kind of strange. At least they weren't in the beginning. The Persians are actually ethnically and linguistically a completely different group of people. They're Indo-European. Persian and Persian language actually has more in common with Greek and Latin than it does with Semitic languages, strangely enough. So Persians are Indo-European peoples. Babylonians, Assyrians, Jews, Phoenicians, these are all Semitic peoples who come from the ancient Near East. So the Persians are coming from the Far East, in what was Persia at the time, and they are divided up into various different tribes. And you have a series of tribes that create kingdoms to the east of Mesopotamia. First you have the Medes, or the Medians, and they are replaced by the Achaemenid dynasty. The Achaemenid dynasty is this very high point of Persian civilization, and they come in. This is the time of Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes. They put their capital at Persepolis. But even then we have new dynasties and new tribes of Persians who come in, the Parthians and the Sasanians. The Persia, it's amazing how little we study Persia. Persia is one of the great civilizations of human history. It's a 1,000-year-long civilization. It's as long as Rome. Or any other of the great civilizations. So it's during the time of the Achaemenids that Persia actually conquers all of the ancient Near East. And we know this because of a wonderful historical document known as the Cyrus Cylinder. So Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, conquers Babylon in the year 540. And the story is told on the Cyrus Cylinder. And the Cyrus Cylinder starts in the voice of the gods. It's the gods who are speaking. And they talk about how the Babylonians have ignored all of their temples. They've let the temples fall into ruin. Even Marduk, the national god of Babylon, is dismayed at the lack of respect that is shown to him. And so the gods cry out to someone who will come and honor the temples. And so they cry out, and then who arrives but Cyrus? Cyrus the Persian. And Cyrus comes in, and he actually conquers Babylon in a very clever way. Babylon was built on both sides of the river, of the Euphrates River, and the river went right through the heart of the city. So what he did is he dammed the river, and that lowered the river enough that he could sneak in through the riverbed into the city. Took it almost without killing anybody. But he's also a very different character, Cyrus, because he comes in and instead of pillaging the city and destroying it and killing everybody, he actually preserves the city. And he frees all of the nations that were in bondage. And Cyrus actually declares that, he's going to make good on all of the gods that gave him favor. So he restores the Temple of Marduk, but he also restores all the religious centers everywhere. And this is why, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, you hear the story of Cyrus. Cyrus returns the Jews to Judah. He returns them to Judea and allows them to rebuild the temple. It even supports them in that cause. And so he establishes a pluralistic society, and this shows how the Persians really are quite different. They are still an empire. They're still a ruler over, they're a nation of nations, several different ethnic groups, but they work out a very pluralistic society. What we mean by a pluralistic society is it's like, we don't care what gods you worship. We don't care what your culture is. What we care is that you obey Persian law, you pay Persian taxes, and if there's a war, you send people to serve in the Persian army. And if you do that, we'll protect you, and you will have all the citizen rights of a citizen of Persia. And that actually was a pretty good deal for most people. It was a heck of a benefit, and it guaranteed a very stable, pluralistic, polyglot society with lots of different nations, and trade and culture, just absolutely prospered. So it really is this kind of golden age that exists. So this is the area we think of Persia. This is modern-day Iran. This is where the Medes and the Persians ultimately come from. But this is the Persian Empire. And it's absolutely vast. It goes all the way from India in the east. So this is modern-day Afghanistan right here. This is modern-day Afghanistan right here. It goes all the way north into Central Asia. This is places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And it goes all the way to the Aegean. It takes all of what was Anatolia. And it does actually go down into Egypt for a while, but it doesn't conquer Egypt entirely. And Persia really is a remarkable society. One of the things that makes it so remarkable is the arrival of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was the native religion of the Persians. The Persians honored all of the gods, but by the time they get to Darius the Great, and Darius the Great is the grandson of Cyrus the Great? Don't quote me on that, but I think that's right. He makes Zoroastrianism into the state religion. So what is Zoroastrianism? Zoroastrianism is the oldest continuous form of monotheism in the world. And at one time, it was the world's largest religion. There are still Zoroastrians today. Some of them live in India. Some of them live in modern-day Iran. There's maybe about 2 million of them spread around the world. The most famous Zoroastrian was Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury, the lead singer for Queen. He was a Zoroastrian. But Zoroastrians believed in a prophet by the name of Zoroaster. Zoroaster is not the name of the god. The god's name is actually Ahura Mazda. And Zoroastrians don't call themselves Zoroastrians. They call themselves Mazdayasna, people who follow Mazda. And Zoroaster taught that there was good and evil in the world. Asha, meaning truth or justice, and Druj, meaning evil or injustice. And that at the center of this universe, you have Ahura Mazda, who's the great creator god, who created everything to be good. And then you have, I think it's Agrumanyu. Agrumanyu is the spirit of evil. And the spirit of evil comes around and he corrupts all of the good things. And so you have an obligation to follow truth, to follow justice, to speak truthfully, to render justice. And this is also in terms of justice and social justice, compassion, charity, kindness to the stranger, those kind of things. And you have this obligation to do this. And they have a set of scriptures known as the Avestas. And you read the Avestas. And many ideas that we associate with Judeo-Christian religion actually originate probably in Zoroastrianism. They believed in an end times. They believed that there would be a final conflict between good and evil, between this Agrumanyu and Ahura Mazda, and that Ahura Mazda and the forces of Asha, of truth, would ultimately triumph, and Druj would be banished, and the whole world would be brought back into order. And so instead of this battle between good and evil, it would just be good. And they believed that there was a Messiah, a great hero who would come, who would achieve this. If you look into Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly Jewish tradition, they don't have much in the way of an afterlife in the Bible. There's not much in the way of an afterlife described in the Bible. But Zoroastrians believe that there's an afterlife, that if you are good and just and true, you go on to Pardesh. And Pardesh is paradise. And paradise, our word paradise, actually comes from Pardesh, which is a Persian word. So even the word for paradise is a Persian word. So Zoroastrianism promotes fairness, justice, and law in society. And so it's adopted as the state religion by Darius I, and he puts up this enormous inscription at Behistun. And this is, to cuneiform, what the Rosetta Stone is to hieroglyphics. It has this inscription in Akkadian, and Elamite and Persian and a few other languages, I think. I'm not entirely certain. But this allowed people to kind of translate cuneiform going all the way back. It's really remarkable. But in it, it has this scene, and this scene is a scene of Darius receiving prisoners and granting, and so he has a symbol of power. So it looks very similar to the Babylonian Assyrian. Notice he has his bow, the extension of the power. But the big change here is that instead of multiple gods, we have just this symbol. Now this is exactly the same symbol that the Neo-Assyrians used to describe Ashur, but here it has become reinterpreted, and it becomes the Faravahar. And the Faravahar it's not exactly a representation of Ahura Mazda. It is a representation of the spirit of Ahura Mazda, let's say that. But it is this winged solar disk that has a figure emerging from it, and he holds forth a loop representing order and justice. And so this will become the symbol of the Zoroastrians, and we'll see it forever after this. So the Zoroastrians, the Persians, the Achaemenid dynasty under Darius and Cyrus established Persepolis, this city. This city is located in what is modern-day Iran, so it's nearly as far away from Babylon as Babylon is from the Levant. So it moves the capital even further east, and it's an amazing complex. It's a series of massive pillared halls. These halls would have served as both private residence, but also as audience halls for the rulers of the Achaemenid dynasty. The ruins are still there, and they're incredible. Vast, extensive, sprawling complex. You can see some of the columns and the bases of the columns are still there, but this would have just been a forest of columns. One of these rooms is actually called the Hall of 100 Columns. Here you can see all of the columns that exist there. So we're going to take a look first at the Gate of Xerxes. And then later we're going to take a look at the throne room, which is the Apadana, which is where the individuals would greet guests. So this was called the Gate of All Nations. And remember, Persia is a pluralistic society. All cultures are welcome in Persian society as long as you accept Persian law and pay Persian taxes and serve in the Persian army. They're happy to let you live and worship as you please. That's an amazing kind of society. And so that's why this was called the Gate of All Nations, because all of the nations that were controlled by the Persian emperor would flow through it. And it's a square building that has gates on all four sides that would shuttle people to the various parts of the palace. Here it is today. You guys see center columns supporting the interior, but it would have had these massive Lamassu that are just colossal. I hope you can see the person in the background to get a sense of how big this is. This section here is easily over 6 feet high. These are just colossal. But this is imagery that we're used to. This is stuff that we've seen before. We have these bull figurines with human heads. But notice that we don't have the fifth leg. So the fifth leg has gone missing. So by this point, they have decided everybody knows what this is. We don't need to interpret this as a relief sculpture. We can interpret this as a sculpture in the round. So it shows there's this kind of advancement in their thinking, even though the figures remain very sophisticated, but still very highly abstracted and stylized. Moving on to the audience hall. The audience hall has a massive staircase that leads up to a platform. This platform was just the porch that had a huge columned hall, and that led to an interior that was just a forest of massive columns. The wood was made, the ceiling was made out of wood. It was wooden beams. So these were just colossal trees that had to be brought from many, many miles away. The columns have lotus blossoms for the tops and the capitals, and then on top of that we have these volutes, these spiral forms. You can see the spiral forms here. And these again are stylized representations of palm trees. So we have lotus blossoms and palm trees, and then at the very top we have double capitals, and the double capitals are made out of griffins or bulls, and directly on their backs would rest the beams or the brackets that would hold up the wooden roof. All of this would have been fabulously painted and covered in tile and ceramics and painted. It's just been really gorgeous. Several of the columns are still there. These are the lotus bases that you can see. And this is taking inspiration probably from further east, where lotus blossoms in India were significant, but lotus blossoms are also significant in Egypt, so there's a wide variety of influences. Here's a close-up of the columns, and again, the scale is just massive. You know, the lotus blossom bases themselves are, you know, taller than I am, and then you have these huge column capitals. Again, a double capital that would, the beams of the roof would rest right on the backs here. This is one shaped like griffins. Here's another one, and here's some details. You can see that they're very heavily stylized. You have these tightly patterned little spirals that represent the beard or the fur of the animal. On the staircase itself, there are depictions, again, representing power and authority. Here we have a scene of the immortals. The immortals are the bodyguard of the Persian emperor. They're called the immortals because they were such scary warriors. The rumor got started that they were immortal, that they could not be killed. And so we see an array of those. This is on one staircase leading up. Here's another staircase. Notice that this staircase has a simplified version of the Faravahar. When we look at this relief, the relief is pretty shallow. Here are these other immortals, and it's also very, very stylized. It has that kind of combination of profile and forward eye. You can see that each part of the beard is just a very tightly coiled spiral. So very stylized. You can also see that same stylization, a kind of flat graphic quality. It's beautiful, but it's a flat graphic quality in this image of a lion attacking a bull. So the lion here representing the king himself, and the bull representing other nations. And when we look at the relief, again, it's a very shallow relief, but very, very tight details. But you can see the little squiggles into the hair. It's very tightly controlled. One of my favorite features of the staircase is the staircase shows tribute scenes. And so again, the rulers of Persia very much wanted to show themselves as rulers of many nations. And so all of the nations flow to them, bringing gifts. Here you have Arabs bringing camels. You have other groups bringing sheep and horses and carts. Here is a procession of Persians. You can always tell Persians because they have these high crowns or these domed crowns. And they're bringing, these are bows. These are bows in their cases. Here's another view of Persians coming the other direction. So Persians are always at front because, hey, it's the Persian Empire. But elsewhere, you'll see Arabs. You can always tell Arabs because they have their heads wrapped in veils. And one of my favorite things is that you can actually see them walking up the stairs. That as you walk up the stairs, you see all of these nations walking up the stairs themselves. So it's a really kind of meta, the way they share the same space with you. And all of this ultimately leads to a depiction here. This is Xerxes, and Xerxes is seated on the throne, and this is his investiture ceremony, and standing behind him is his father, Darius. And behind them are the bodyguards. You can see they're holding these war hammers and bows and spears. And then coming up to them are governors who are standing in front of incense stands, who are bringing their hand to their mouth. That's a gesture we saw all the way back at the Stele of Hammurabi. This gesture of respect to indicate that this is the person of authority. We also have, they're also incredibly skilled in gold and silver and ceramics. We can only talk a little bit about it. Just this is this beautiful lion-headed drinking vessel. Notice how tightly patterned it is. At Nashka Rustum, we have these beautiful tombs. These are carved right into the cliff face. And if you look, this is the tomb of Darius himself. The front of this is actually depicted as if it is an entrance to an Apadana. Notice that we have the same kind of double-headed column capitals. This is the tomb of Xerxes I, looking very, very similar. When you look up to the top of these things, we have a very unique scene. we have a scene of the emperor himself, again holding a bow, evidence this is his ability to project power. In front of him is a shrine, but we also see the fire of Ahar and Ahura Mazda, the essence of the kind of symbol of the spirit of Ahura Mazda, blessing him. But he is standing on a throne. You can see that we have the legs of the throne are here. It has lion heads on either side. And underneath the throne are all these people. When we look at this in detail, you'll notice that the throne itself is actually not on the ground. It's actually created so that it looks like it's being supported by the people themselves. Now, in some way, this is a symbol of domination and subjugation, but it's also a way of showing that the entire Persian Empire is a nation of many, many people. These aren't necessarily negative images. They're not shown as servants or slaves or people in bondage. In fact, they all have swords. Notice that? They all have swords or weapons or maces. So these are warriors. And so these are elites. And what he is saying that, I may be king, but my throne is supported by my people. And the truth is that for most of the history of Persia, the king really did have the support of his people. People prospered under Persia. It was kind of a good deal. I want to point out that two of these characters here are Greeks. They're Lydians and Ionians. These are peoples who we would have regarded as Greeks or adjacent to Greek culture, and they would have been found in this region here. This is the eastern regions of the Aegean. And so his empire actually included people that would have been regarded as Greek. And that's significant because when we start talking about the Greeks, we're going to find that the Greeks and the Persians run into a little bit of a Donnybrook, so to speak, and that this is very important for the development of Greek art. Now, just quickly, I want to finish out with the Levant. I want to talk about this region here. This is the Levant. This is the area where we have the modern state of Israel. Okay? Now, when we look to the modern state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, of course, is the same location as the ancient kingdom of Israel. We had both the unified kingdom, and then it split into the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And this will become important to Western art because, of course, the Jews create the Bible, and it is out of Judaism that Christianity comes, and Christianity will become the dominant religion of Europe. So we actually have to look to this region for a lot of Western civilization. The thing that's fascinating about the Levant is that it's a cultural crossroads. It never is the home to any major kingdoms. Instead, they're small kingdoms. And most of these kingdoms are tribute kingdoms. They're not really big powers. They are actual tributaries or vassal states to other powers. At the end of the Bronze Age, they're dominated by the Egyptians. Then the Assyrians come in the early Iron Age and conquer them. Then the Babylonians, then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then I didn't write it there, but the Romans as well. And so we're going to see a lot of different groups. There are Canaanites, which are kind of native groups. There are the Israelites, who we know from the Bible. There's also Phoenicians, and there's also the Philistines, who are this transplanted group that live here in what's known as the Gaza Strip. These are peoples who are transplanted here from the Aegean. So when we look at art from this region, not surprisingly, it's going to blend all of the cultures together. This is a ivory, and this is a Canaanite ivory, and it's coming from a place called Har Megiddo. Har Megiddo is a city in the Jezreel Valley in the northern part of Israel. But you can see that the figures here are Egyptian. We have a cartouche, we have the staff of Waz, so here's the staff of Waz. We have people in Egyptian clothing. Here is what we call a Syro-Palestinian ivory, because it mixes aspects of Syrian culture, but also Palestinian and Egyptian culture. This is probably some kind of, back to either a fan or a scepter, not entirely certain. But when we look at the drawing, we see a figure who is enthroned, and a procession of individuals, and a person in a chariot leading prisoners. Some of their characteristics look Egyptian, but some of their characteristics look Syrian. You can see the same thing in these ivory plaques. Here we have a griffin. Griffins are, you know, more commonly Phoenician and Near Eastern, but it has the head of a human, like a sphinx. Here we have sphinx again, but with wings. And here we have a griffin that looks exactly like the griffins we were seeing in the Aegean. Body of a lion and, you know, these very dramatic wings. Now, why is this significant to the study of Judeo-Christian culture? Because when we read the Bible, there's an awful lot of description of religious artifacts in the Bible. The Bible describes the Tabernacle of Moses, and in the Tabernacle of Moses is the Ark of the Covenant. This is taken from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, when you see depictions of the Ark of the Covenant, it usually shows these two figures on the top as angels, as humanoid angels with wings. These are the cherubim. And according to the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant represents the throne of God. It's the mercy seat of God, and it's where God sits. But you can't show an image of God because that's forbidden in Jewish law under the second commandment. You cannot have any images of God. But instead what you have is two cherubim whose wings overshadow the place where God resides. And when we think of cherubs and cherubims, well, you know, after the Renaissance, you think of cherubs as big fat baby angels, or you think of them as human angels. But cherubim, or cherubim, is very closely related to the word for griffin. Gerufim. Gerufim, cherubim, they're practically the same word. One comes to us through the Phoenician and into the Greek. The other one comes to us through the Hebrew. And so they probably didn't look like this. They probably didn't look like these angels that we imagine. They probably looked more like Lamassu or sphinxes, as in this depiction. And this is a very similar idea to the idea that we see in the ancient Near East. Remember, in the ancient Near East, you have these Lamassu. They flank the entrances. Why do they flank the entrances? Because the entrance is where the king goes, and the king is divine. So here we have two sphinxes, or two Lamassu, or Shedu, that flank the divine space. You can really start to see this in this object. This is a very famous object found in Tanakh. This is the Tanakh incense stand. And it's amazing because it's a grab bag of all the different religions in the area and all the various different expressions of religion in the area. So let me go through this. At the very top you have a bull with a sun on its back. Solar imagery is very much a feature. Solar imagery in bulls is very much a feature of Egyptian and Near Eastern art. Here you can see the sun in between its horns. So the bull is the animal that carries the sun across the sky. Here is, in the center section here, is a kind of tree flanked by animals and by ibexes on either side. This is very much like these poles or depictions of trees that were probably made out of metal. So this is, when the Bible says tree or pole, sometimes it's talking about an actual tree, but most of the time it's talking about this thing crafted out of metal that represents the feminine aspect. When you ever hear the Asherah described in the Bible, that's what they are. At the very bottom, we have a scene of a woman between two lions. This is very similar to images of Astarte or Ishtar. And then right here, we have two sphinx-like characters with human faces and wings, and in them is an empty space. This is a form of aniconic representation. Aniconic representation is where you show something by not showing it. You show the void or the empty space. And this was typical of Jewish cultures, but it wasn't just typical of Jewish culture, it was typical of a lot of Near Eastern culture. So this stand is fantastic because it shows all the different ways that the aspects of deity can be imagined, as this mistress of the animals, as the Asherah, as the solar bull imagery, and also as this aniconic space, this void that represents the presence of God between two divine creatures, two sphinx-like creatures. And when we start looking around Israel, we do find things like at Tel Arad that look remarkably like the description of the Jewish temple. So we have very, kind of elaborate descriptions of the tabernacle, but we also have elaborate descriptions of the Temple of Solomon. We have later descriptions of the temple under Ezekiel, for example. And here we have a building that has a kind of forecourt with an altar, and then it has a place that is reserved as the holy section, and then we have a sanctuary beyond that, like a holy of holies. And in that sanctuary, we have 2 incense altars, and then we have 2 beetles or stones. And these stones represent the sacred presence, but they're aniconic. Instead of being sculpted as figures, they just represent their presence. So Tel Arad, has many of these characteristics. And if we go a little further into Syria, again, this is another tragedy. This thing was destroyed during the Syrian civil war. It's really tragic. But we have another temple. This is at Ain Dara. And this temple also has a lot in common with the descriptions of the Temple of Solomon. As you go into the entrance is flanked by these large winged sphinx creatures with human heads and wings and the feet of lions. So when we look at descriptions of the Temple of Solomon, it fits into this very well. We don't have a single shred of archaeological evidence for the Temple of Solomon. The place that the Temple of Solomon stood has been knocked down and rebuilt so many times, it's doubtful anything ever would have existed. But we do have this written record of it, and this written record describes an interior that is decorated with these sphinx-like cherubim. That you have these sphinx-like cherubim that flank the royal space with the Ark of the Covenant, and they're very much like the Lamassu and the Shedu. We even have descriptions of there being palm trees around the interior. That's really remarkable because, remember, if we zip back to the Babylonians had palm trees that went around the royal space. And even if we go to the Bible says that King Solomon had his palace decorated with palm trees. So the visual culture described in the Bible fits up perfectly with what we see in the ancient Near East. And that's really remarkable. It's enough to give us a sense that this has to be somehow accurate. Maybe it wasn't as, the Bible describes the Temple of Solomon as being just decked out in gold. Every square inch of it is covered in gold. Maybe it wasn't that rich. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. But the iconography is dead on. The iconography is exactly what we would expect for an Iron Age temple at the time. And the structures that we see at the time are very similar with these palm trees and sphinx-like structures and cherubim. If we think of them as cherubim the way we think of cherubim as fat baby angels, that it doesn't work. But if we recognize that that's not what they meant by it, that's what we've come to misinterpret it, and that's something that's happened since the Renaissance, because it's like a 2,000-year game of telephone. By the time you get to the end, you get something completely different. But in the context of the archaeology in the region at the time, it fits perfectly. It's exactly what we would expect to see. And ultimately, this culture will go on to influence Christianity, which will go on to influence these other cultures. So that's another reason for why it's justifiable to study the ancient Near East. Even though European culture doesn't share anything ethnically and linguistically with the ancient Near East, they did adopt a religion that was a branch off of this religion. And this religion was very much a part of the visual culture and the cultural milieu of the Iron Age of the ancient Near East. Okay, so that's where we'll stop it. We'll end it there. No lectures on Monday because it's Memorial Day. Enjoy the break. But Wednesday we're going to come back with a vengeance and talk about Greece. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.